Hello. Recently, the BBC were overjoyed to announce that they'd found that there were Vikings who were Muslims, and their evidence for that was a piece of cloth that I'm just going to put. Have a look at it now. I'm just going to insert it into the video. You notice that they took a very small piece of that cloth and then interpreted that as being the word Allah written in a mirror. They didn't use the rest of the cloth though, because if you look further down the cloth, it had also got swastikas there. So can we make the assumption that, as well as being Muslims, that they were also National Socialists, and perhaps they went around with little skulls and crossbones on their helmets, and Zeke Heil as they were going around the place? Well, of course we can't. It's a pattern. The swastika came from India. The Vikings traded all over the world. They may well have seen the pattern there that's the Allah written in mirror writing. It doesn't make them Muslims. One can also ask, well, if there were all these Viking Muslims, what happened to them? Don't know. But there was a link between the Vikings and the Muslim world. And in his series, Michael Wood, who did a BBC series many years ago, I don't think the BBC would repeat that series now. He explains the link between the Muslim world and the Viking world, and I'd like to read that to you. Just put my glasses on. One of the joys of getting older. Yeah, you have to wear glasses to read. And I've even had to stop training this week for a while because I've got tennis elbow. So my attempts to bench press £300 again, I'll have to wait for a short time. Let's read this passage to you. From the mid-9th century, thousands were taken captive, from Ireland in particular. The Vikings planned their descents with cunning cruelty, often raiding on major Christian festivals, when they knew towns would be thronging with pilgrims. Armagh, for example, was raided at Christmas in 926, and at St. Martin's Eve in 933. The Irish annals of the 10th century present a grim catalogue of misery, which goes through Eric's day. I presume that's Eric Bloodaxe. 3,000 or more captured, with great booty in cows, horses, gold and silver, around Kells in 951. The Irish Viking towns were clearinghouses, exchange ports for this trade. At first glance, if you had landed at the quay of Viking Dublin in 950, you might see little difference from the Viking quarters of York. The familiar streets of laid split timber, the dirty industrial quarter, the narrow planked houses jammed close together. But Dublin was quite different in character to the settled city life of York. The Dublin Norse colonists lived on the edge of Irish society, never occupying the land to any great extent. They were fewer and wealthier than in Britain. Entrepreneurs. Let's move on a little bit. By the late 10th century in Dublin, they were minting large coinages, modelled exactly on those of the Anglo-Saxon kings. And the widespread trade in England implied by this was probably slaves. Young Britons, Anglo-Saxons, shipped to Dublin, Wexford and Waterford, and then sold on to Spain, North Africa, and down the Russian river routes to eastern Islam. Only aristocrats stood a chance of being ransomed. Most people who were abducted never saw their home villages again. Indeed, for many, it was their last sight of the British Isles. An Arab traveller of Eric's time, who came to Spain, remarked on the great number of European slaves in the harems. The palace of the Emir of Cordova in particular had many white girls, though chiefly Frankish and Italian. Of these unfortunate people, the Vikings were undoubtedly a major source of supply. They had easy access to Christian captives, and they had no scruples about enslaving them. The Arabs in Spain saw the long-term potential of the trade, and in the early 840s sent a diplomatic mission to Scandinavia to put it on an organised basis. Most British slaves, though, seem to have ended up on the Russian river route to eastern Islam. that was the link between Vikings and the Islamic world. The Vikings provided them with European slaves. The Vikings didn't convert to Islam. They converted to Christianity. They stopped slaving, and their ancestors, the Normans, played a key role not only in the Crusades, but also in taking back Sicily and southern Italy, from the Muslim invaders. It was the great Welsh thinker and historian Gwyn Williams that stated the past was an inquiry, and we ask the past questions, and those questions differ depending on who we are. The BBC asks its questions. I ask my questions. I invite you not to take the world from my perspective or from the BBC perspective. I invite you to go out and develop your own perspective. Become a free individual with your own ideas. After all, isn't that the greatest inheritance that our Anglo-Saxon ancestors could give to us? A love of individuality. I better just say before the end a little bit about the swastika as well. I know that the Vikings didn't trade directly with India. However, they did trade with Eastern Islam, and they did trade with Byzantium, so they would have come across Indian products. I also know that swastika isn't particularly an Indian symbol. It's an Indo-European symbol. Originated on the Russian steppe and would have come into Europe and gone down into India with the Indo-European people. It meant something very different in the days of the Vikings than it did after the 20th century. I believe in those times it was a symbol of peace. Just goes to show you that things change, and not always for the better. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.